Welcome to the PBL and K-2 webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sara Hallermann, and I'm a District Services Manager for the Buck Institute for Education. And I'm also a primary author of PBL in the elementary grades. And I'm really happy to have Sharon Esswein serving as a guest presenter today. And I'll let Sharon go ahead and introduce herself.
Thanks for inviting me, Sara. My name is Sharon Esswein. I'm a literacy coach in the Professional Development Department for Hilliard City Schools.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And later on in this webinar, Sharon is going to tell the story about a fantastic second grade project that she taught. So we look forward to hearing her story. So in this webinar, we are going to explore the following driving question. What makes a great K-2 project? We're going to discuss aspects of both project design but also implementation that really produce great projects in K-2. But before we dive into this content, I'd like you to take a few moments and just reflect about the driving question. I'd like to hear your thoughts. It would be great if you could post your responses using the chat feature. So what do you think? What makes a great K-2 project? Fantastic. Promotes early literacy. Is very engaging. Absolutely. Authenticity. We're seeing a thread here with authenticity. Starts with student interest and ignites. Oh, I'm sorry, integrates the art.
Ignites.
And ignites. Fantastic. These are great thoughts. Thank you so much. So before we move on, I wanted to just explain how we're going to handle questions and comments in this webinar. We're going to review the key questions that we'll address in this webinar in a moment. But as we walk you through this content, what I'd like you to do is to feel free to continue to use the chat feature to pose questions and to make comments. But I want you to know we've blocked off time at the end to respond to questions. And I also want you to know that this session is going to be saved at the BIE website, and Alfred from BIE posted a link to that where you will be able to find it in case you'd like to review it again or share the link with your colleagues. We absolutely encourage you to do so. So let's go ahead and begin by reviewing the key questions that connect to the driving question that we're going to address in this webinar. How can K-2 teachers effectively launch projects, build student understanding and skills in a project, help students develop and revise their ideas and their products, prepare students to effectively present their products? We're going to periodically refer to resources in PBL in the elementary grades. You'll see that in some cases on slides, I've noted the page numbers where you can find a particular resource in the book. But I want you to know that owning a copy of this book certainly is not a requirement for this webinar. So every project has typical phases, although we know that no two projects are exactly alike. But we know that generally every project has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so we've captured these phases in this flow of a project diagram. If you want to take a peek at a visual representation of these phases, you can look at the diagram on page 46 in PBL in the elementary grades. So what we're going to do in this webinar is we are going to highlight strategies for using project-based learning with younger students in each one of these phases. Some of the tips that we're going to review also appear as K-2 how-to tips in the book PBL in the elementary grades. So let's go ahead and begin with our very first key question. How can K-2 teachers effectively launch projects? During the launching phase, with older students, we know that teachers often pack a lot of activities into the very first day. So we see teachers launching with the entry event, reviewing the driving question, discussing the culminating products and the audience. With secondary students, teachers also generally move students into their teams on the very first day. But what we want to reflect about today is how might this be different for K-2? So what I like to do is begin by focusing on the very first thing that happens in any project, regardless of the grade level, the entry event. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about the question posted at the top of this slide. How do we know if an entry event is successful? So let me give you a moment just to think about that and go ahead and post your thoughts using the chat feature. How do we know if an entry event is really successful? It provides structure to thinking that can be applied in different contexts. I love this. Kids want to know more. I agree. Kids buy in, they're immediately excited, they get interested, they're engaged. Fantastic. So let's talk about what is the actual purpose of an entry event. A really well-designed entry event, just as some of you have posted in your comments, it should generate interest and curiosity in the students. We want it to grab their attention, but most importantly, we want it to lead them to ask questions and make them want to take further steps. A teacher in a workshop once told me that from her perspective, an entry event leads students to the edge of the water and entices them to want to jump in. And I just love that. So what I'd like to do now is take a moment and review a sample kindergarten entry event from PBL in the elementary grades. This is from the Creatures in Oldham County project, one of our spotlight projects, and I'll go ahead and read this entry event to you. Dear kindergarten students, my name is Shauna and I work for the Oldham County Conservation District. We help people in our community by showing them how to take care of the land. I heard that the kindergarten students at St. Francis School were great scientists who might be able to help me with something I need for my job. I would like to have a picture book to teach the people who live in Oldham County about the life cycles of some of the animals that live here. You might have to do some research and work together to find information for your book. You will also have to become authors and illustrators. It may be hard work, but I know that you can do it. Do you think you could help me? Sincerely, Shauna, the district program coordinator. So the driving question for this project was, how can we create a picture book about the life cycle of the creatures in Oldham County? Abby, the teacher, the kindergarten teacher, and her students in this particular setting are absolutely fascinated by animals and they love the outdoors. And so I believe that the way in which this project was designed, it really is a good example of an authentic literacy project. So I want to take a moment and just explain why this project in particular meets the criteria for an authentic literacy project, because personally I think those projects are highly effective for the K-2 crowd. So in this project, what Abby set her students up to do was to create an authentic product that actually met a real need. In this case, it was a book about local animals created for the local conservation district. They had research notebooks and they were supported in generating their own questions. And so the questions that the students created really provided the frame for their investigation. So that despite the fact that these students were kindergarten students, they really did dive into research framed around their own questions. They used authentic sources to find answers to their questions. So in addition to just reading informational texts, and they absolutely did a lot of that in this investigation, they also conducted interviews and they engaged in field work. The school happens to be located in a semi-rural farming community, and it has a nature preserve that is adjacent to the school, and there's abundant wildlife. So it really provides a fantastic setting for that type of field work. The process involved critique so that students could really demonstrate perseverance and really polish their work. So Abby heavily emphasized that during the process. And then their final product was presented to the organization that actually needed their work, the representatives from the conservation district. So this project is anchored in science standards, but it addresses literacy standards, and it involves research, the development of an informational book. So certainly there was a lot of informational writing, and it also involved the delivery of an oral presentation at the end. And as a teacher, Abby is really, really focused on going beyond just fact-focused instruction in science and social studies. This is a science-focused project, but she wanted to really make sure that it involved an in-depth exploration of rich content, despite the young age of her students. So she decided to center it upon these key understandings. Animals go through a series of orderly changes. Changes in living things occur in cycles, and life cycles differ among various animals. And she thought the most effective way to do this with young students was to focus on, to create an interesting context by focusing on life cycles of animals that actually live in their community. So to heighten the sense of authenticity and help motivate students to really want to do high quality work, the way in which she structured this was that she actually asked the representative from the local conservation organization to come to her class to deliver the entry event to students. And what type of reaction do you think she received? They were absolutely on the edge of their seat, she reported. But most importantly, they had their hands raised and they were full of questions. And going back to the criteria we discussed for an entry event, for an effective entry event for K-2, one way in which you know you are successful is if not only are they excited and curious, but they're posing questions. So this definitely was effective in posing questions. So what are some other things to consider when planning entry events for the K-2 student population? We found that sometimes a single entry event to launch a project might not grab and focus the younger children as quickly as it does with older students. For a variety of reasons. They may not have experience with the project topic. We certainly know that students really have varying degrees of prior knowledge. So planning a two-part entry event can be really helpful. So before sharing an entry letter, like the one that Abby shared in her project, it can be really helpful to plan an experience to get your students' feet wet with the project content and to activate their prior knowledge. So for example, let's say you've designed a project about creating informational signage for a local nature area. One of the first things that you can do is start by taking the children to that setting. Let them observe, draw pictures, write, interview each other about their observations, and then after you've engaged in that experience, then bring the guest speaker in from the organization and have that person ask the students for help. That can be really effective. So that's one of our tips that we've provided in PBL in the elementary grades is sometimes having a two-part entry event can be effective. A lot of times in our PBL 101s, teachers feel as though everything needs to happen on the first day. And with younger students, that you may need to make some adjustments in that regard and let the entry event unfold over more than one day. So let's move on to what frames every project, the driving question. So for students, the driving question really needs to capture the heart of the project in really clear and compelling language and provide a springboard and direction for the project. When we're delivering PBL 101 sessions and follow-up support for K-2 teachers, they often report that the task of crafting a really clear driving question for that audience can be a little challenging. So let's take a moment and review the two types of driving questions outlined in PBL in the elementary grades. So you can specify a product to be created, a task to be done, or a problem to solve. I'll give you a moment just to read over the driving questions under that category. Or you can focus on a philosophical or a debatable issue or an intriguing topic. So in PBL and the elementary grades on page 39, we have provided a template that you can use to design a driving question that specifies the role that they'll play and the authentic product that they will create. And so we find that all elementary teachers appreciate this tool. They find it to be helpful. One tip, though, for lower elementary when using this template, you need to make sure that you don't produce a driving question that's too wordy. So we encourage you to use the template, and then reflect upon the length of the driving question. If it seems too wordy, go ahead and reduce some of the language, because you certainly want to make sure that it's an appropriate length for your students. So I'd like to just talk about some additional tips regarding driving questions. One really general tip is, when you write your question, write it with your students in mind. And after you have a draft, just imagine how your students are going to respond. If you think it could potentially create any confusion for some students, as is captured on the child's expression in the first picture on the left, you definitely want to do a revision. So think to yourself, would it be difficult potentially for some students to grasp? Or do you feel like students are likely going to be able to understand the question? But also, do you anticipate that it will prompt them to wonder about the topic of investigation? We know that the driving question is certainly not something that we just share with students on the first day and only on the first day. It's something that we continue to revisit throughout the duration of the project. So can you see yourself revisiting the driving question throughout the project? Let's move on to our second key question. How can K-2 teachers effectively build student knowledge, understanding, and skills in a project? So after launching the project, teachers begin to build knowledge, understanding, and skills that their students need to create high quality products, and so that they can answer the driving question. So in the Creatures in Oldham County project, Abby provided each student with a research notebook in which they would record questions, notes, and drawings. She built background knowledge by facilitating a science workshop about the human life cycle and the ways in which people change. Then the students created human life cycle charts with illustrations and descriptions. And finally, students were introduced to the life cycle of a chicken through video clips. Class also visited a local farm to observe real eggs, chicks, and chickens. And then they went outside to observe animals found in the woodlands near the school campus. And they generated their own research questions based on a combination of experiences. She brought in butterfly larvae, ladybugs, and frog eggs into the classroom for observation. And then she incorporated a lot of informational reading on the topic during her reader's workshop. On page 92 in PBL in the elementary grades, we offer a list of sample steps for facilitating inquiry in a project. I'm going to let you just browse through that list for a moment. So we're going to focus on step 1. What does this process look like for young students? Young children really need a lot of assistance in this phase of the project. When we deliver workshops for K-2 teachers, the teachers sometimes indicate that they feel like they struggle to find resources that are appropriate for their grade level that connect to the topic of investigation. What images come to mind when we think about the term source? An image of a book comes to mind, right? It does for me. But K2 PBL teachers report that it's really helpful to develop a broad definition of the term source when launching investigations with young children. Although informational text and fiction are absolutely essential, it can be really helpful to think beyond books when assembling resources that young children can use to investigate the project topic and find answers to their need to know questions. So what we're going to do now is we're going to explore some different types of sources of information for young children. Objects, compelling pictures and photographs, illustrations, diagrams and drawings, magazines and newspapers, and videos. These are all examples of sensory sources that can be used to build background knowledge and understanding in a project. And in a few moments, Sharon is actually going to tell the story about her project, and she will mention some of the sources that she used. Graphic sources, charts and diagrams, tables, graphs, and timelines. These are all examples of graphic sources that can be used to build background knowledge and understanding in a project. Setting students up to conduct interviews or engage in field work can be really, really powerful. Field work can be a really, really effective tool for building background knowledge, understanding, and skill with young children when it's properly structured. So we're going to offer a few tips about the concept of field work. One really basic thing that you can do is just be careful about your terminology. Call the experience a field experience rather than a field trip. The term field trip implies that the students are going to be spectators. Field work really gives the students the idea that they are active investigators. When you design the field work, make sure that you set it up so it has a really clear purpose in the project. How does the work that they are doing relate to the driving question? How does it connect to the culminating product that they will create? What are students doing? Will they collect data, conduct interviews? Are you setting them up to complete observations that will result in sketches that will be useful for their project? So just make sure that you're clear about their purpose and certainly that the students are clear about the purpose. And set the students up to be real researchers. One thing that's really, really critical is that you need to make sure that you explicitly teach any skills that you want the students to use during the fieldwork experience. Just make sure that they're really well prepared. So at this point, Sharon Esswein is going to share some information about some of the highly successful strategies that she used during a second grade project that she taught. But before we do that, what I want to do is just share a little information about this fantastic school district, Hilliard City Schools. They're located in Hilliard. It's a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. They serve a growing population. Approximately 25% of the students qualify for free and reduced lunch. About 7% of the students in Hilliard are English learners. They have a huge commitment to personalized learning in this district. They've really embraced project-based learning as a school improvement strategy, and they've achieved very, very positive results. Hilliard City Schools students are gaining more academic growth than any other school district in the state. So the Buck Institute for Education has absolutely enjoyed having the opportunity to partner with Hilliard. I personally, in conducting some of the work here, have been so impressed with the level of dedication towards making learning really rigorous, relevant, and engaging for students. So at this point, I'll pass it off to Sharon, who's going to talk with us about her project.
Thanks, Sarah. I'd like to share and tell you about a project we did with our second graders. Our driving question there is posted on the screen. How can we create an informational brochure for families that are moving into our community? And the end product brochures were made available to families that were new to Hilliard. And it was really part of a year-long investigation of this concept of contribution. We really set students up to make a contribution of their own by creating a product that's really is truly useful for families that are in need of that information. How did we build the background knowledge? You can see at the first bullet, we actually were wandering through brochures and pamphlets. I actually went to the AAA and got lots of different pamphlets, and we looked at those as far as what did they notice about those. They noticed bold print. They noticed things like captions, maps, labels. One thing that they came up with that I hadn't thought of, they said, it really is highlighting the good things about whatever the brochure is about, the good things about what happens at the zoo. So it was like a persuasive, an advertisement. You want to come to this place because of all these good things that are there. So we just spread them all out, and then we came back together and we did a shared writing, a list of everything that they noticed. The important point I want to make here is that when I had done this in the past, it was me more telling them a brochure is an informational thing so you can find out about this or that. Here it was much more about the children owning it and making that discovery themselves, and then us coming up with that list together. I really feel that what you discover, you actually own yourself. I mean, that's part of, I heard Sara say earlier, of it becomes embedded and becomes part of you in that learning experience. So that got them all excited about making brochures of their own. We actually had a student that was also new to our class, didn't know where the library was. That was the first question that came up. Where is the Hilliard Public Library? Well, gosh, we can make something that shows there's other new families in our community, just like your family. Let's do that for our contribution. In looking at the pamphlets, we thought, what do we want to include? What about the visuals? How's that going to enhance our writing product? In the second bullet, we also browsed some other nonfiction text just about communities in general. We also looked at community maps, and that helped us see some things that we hadn't thought of before. One of them was our Senior Citizen Center. Yes, we'd probably have senior citizens moving in. That would be a place that they would want to know about. Where is that located? We might want to put a map in there. This whole idea of contribution was actually built upon because we had a new principal at our building, and we actually had interviewed her, and we talked to her about the talent she had and what contributions she would be making to our school community. And then we went and we interviewed people like our cook, we interviewed our nurse, our custodian, our librarian. So this idea of everybody has special talents and contributions was one that they were used to, and this brochure idea was expanding it out to the community. Okay. What about how did we conduct interviews? One source of information that we used about the community were actually we interviewed people from these different places. For instance, we interviewed the guy from the pool, a person from the Senior Citizens Center, the grocery store manager, a fireman, a policeman, even we interviewed a pizza delivery person, our library person, just to name a few. So what I'd like to do is walk you through the process that I use to help students with this interview process, because I wanted them to be successful. So the first bullet, as I said, this was built upon they had interviewed people in our school community, and now we were just expanding it out into the Hilliard community. So we came together as a whole group, and we did sort of a shared writing. So I was the one actually doing the writing, and we came up with some questions that we wanted to ask these guests, these people in our community. Things like we talked about, what do we need to know? What would go into the pamphlet? Things like, what services do you offer? Where are you located? What hours are you open? All of those kinds of things that they had really gotten from all these different sources of information. Then, after we came up with a list of questions, we had our first guest in, and it happened to be the store manager of a grocery store. I served as the model, and we took those questions that we had come up with together, and we interviewed this guest. And I was the one taking the brief notes, and they could see me writing. And here's the kinds of things they learned when I'm thinking about our language arts standards. Just some tricks of note taking, how to bullet, how to listen, and then capture really the important thing that the person was saying, not writing down every little word. So those are the kinds of things we talked about after this experience was over. What did you notice about my note taking? Or during the process, I would say, do you see how I'm only going to put this down? So that was a teaching experience in itself. After we did that, we broke into small groups, and the children worked together to interview other people in the community. That was a really helpful support that they had each other. They weren't on their own, because I'd really only, I had modeled that process once, so they had each other. I was so excited and so pleased with the outcome, especially with the success that the students felt, which I think was really important. They were very motivated and engaged, and I really think it was because our mission was real. They owned it. People were actually using their writing. And I think that's a really important celebration part. When we were done with the pamphlets and we actually had our tech teacher come in and help us, we did those on the computer, and they were folded 3 ways, just like a regular pamphlet was. We all went down to the office and put them in a very special container. Those little cases that hold brochures in the office. We had to talk about where we were going to put it. On the countertop, we had to talk to the secretaries and say, now when somebody comes in and they're new to this and they're asking you questions, this is going to help you out. So we made a big point of doing that. That's sort of our publishing, or making our writing public. And then we also sent some over to the central office so that people that came in to inquire about the community would have those to take with them. And I thought what was really interesting was that every time they would go down to the office, like to take the attendance, they would come back, and say, now I talked to Mrs. Clark, and somebody was coming in the other day to inquire about this or that, and they took one of our brochures. So this was sort of an ongoing celebration.
Sharon, thank you so much for telling that story. Wonderful story about an authentic literacy project for young students that was successful and yielded great results. I loved hearing about those strategies.
Thank you.
So let's move on to our third key question. How can K-2 teachers help students develop and revise their ideas and products? So in the developing and revising ideas and products phase, this is when students really just dive into product development. After building background knowledge, understanding, and skills, at some point in the project, students are ready to start creating their products. In PBL, even with young children, we know that one of the key culminating products needs to be developed by a team. And so K-2 teachers often wonder how to really effectively empower young students, especially emergent readers and writers, to collaborate to develop products. So in this section, we're going to focus on offering a few key tips regarding collaboration and project management for young children. One thing that we know is that collaboration, like any other skill, requires scaffolding. And for young students, it will likely require a high degree of scaffolding. In PBL in the elementary grades, we discuss 2 ways to scaffold collaboration skills. So one is to use tools like rubrics or looks like, sound like, T-charts, things of that nature as teaching tools. Or you can coach students by modeling the behaviors that you want your students to demonstrate in the project, observing them engaged in collaboration, and most importantly, providing a lot of clear feedback. One collaboration tip for K-2 teachers is to try to really be realistic about the duration of the time in which students will work in collaborative teams during a day. We know that they really need explicit teaching around collaboration skills, and also they need a lot of practice to build up their stamina for collaboration work. So sometimes post uh, launching a project, when reflecting, we've heard teachers say there were so many things that went really, really well about their project, but there was a struggle in certain aspects of collaboration. And it's just a reflection for the teacher to think about to what degree did I explicitly teach all the skills that I wanted my students to demonstrate? And to what degree was the time frame in terms that I was expecting them to collaborate um, appropriate or effective? So think about that, building up students, young students' stamina for collaborative work. K-2 teachers sometimes refrain from moving students into teams on day one and elect to do it at a later date in the project. It's not necessary, but we want you to know that that is an option for you. And so I'm displaying the project calendar from the Creatures in Oldham County project. And I want to take a moment to review this calendar because I want you to think about the sequence of events and how this project unfolded. What do you notice happened on the very first day in the project? If you feel like posting a response in the chat feature, you can. What was the very first thing that happened in Abby's class? Okay, now what I want you to look at is when did Abby form teams in this project? When did that occur? You'll notice that it wasn't until the end of the first week. And so what happened in between? She elected to do some background building before the students moved into teams. And so this is something that you can consider. And again, no two projects are alike. And it's up to you as a teacher to use your judgment to determine when you want to get them into teams. But for young students, I don't want you to feel that you need to do this on the very first day. If you want to delay that and you think that will be more effective, it's definitely an option for you. Another thing that's really important to consider is to share the collaboration rubric with the students at the launch of the project and really allow time for students to reflect upon their collaboration skills during the project, but then also at the end of the project. We've seen a lot of K-2 PBL teachers using work plans really effectively with their students. So for young students, you might feel that it's more effective to fill out the what needs to be done column for your students. That's absolutely fine. You may want to do this for the students, but then allow teams to determine who's doing what. So it's absolutely fine to adjust these resources that we've provided for you based on what you think would be effective for your students. For emergent readers and writers, you can distribute a sheet. This is a tip I learned from a PBL teacher. You can distribute a sheet that contains images that represent the tasks that they need to complete to create the product and have them cut and paste the images into the work plan and then write their names next to the task that they decided to complete. But one thing I want you to think about if you use this approach is that it may require a lot of scaffolding. Have your students ever been asked to reach consensus as a team? If not, you're going to need to teach them how to do so. You may need to model the process using a fishbowl format before asking students to do so in teams. So again, our key point here is that collaboration skills, especially with young students, really need to be explicitly taught. So let's move on to our final key question. How can K-2 teachers prepare students to present their products and answers to the driving question? So at this phase of the project, it's time to prepare students to present their products. In the Creatures in Oldham County project, students prepared for their presentations by doing a number of things. Abby facilitated conversations around the qualities of an effective presentation. Although they were kindergarten students, those students spent time critiquing video clips of student presentations and analyzing them in relation to the criteria for an effective presentation. They participated in a dress rehearsal with other classes as the audience before they did their presentation with the representatives from the conservation district. So by the time those folks arrived in their classroom, those students were well prepared. So I'd like to just share a few tips to prepare young students to deliver effective presentations. The students will need a lot of explicit instruction regarding how to organize and deliver their presentations, and also how to field questions from the audience if you decide that you want them to do so. You may opt out. You may decide that you're not going to ask your students to field audience questions. Just use your best judgment about that. But if you decide to ask your students to field questions from the audience, make sure that you give really clear guidelines to your audience members. Ask them to keep the questions short and simple and to be reasonable. Schedule practice presentations. I mentioned that Abby did a dress rehearsal with her students. So make sure that they have a chance to practice. And not only that, but that they receive feedback. And not only that, that they have enough time to actually make revisions if necessary. Just remember the importance of content knowledge in PBL also. When students really thoroughly understand the concepts underlying the project topic, their confidence level rises. And that impacts their ability to deliver an effective oral presentation. So as PBL teachers, you'll find that even young students have an easier time presenting about a topic learned through an interesting, in-depth project, as opposed to being asked to just regurgitate facts that they've learned by memorization. So a lot of times with K-2 students, when we ask them to deliver an oral presentation, we're asking them to tell a story about their project. And if you've designed your project so that it's engaging and it sparks their curiosity, they can do so with confidence and ease, especially if you've given them time to prepare. One tip is to help them develop props that they can use to tell their story. We want to refrain from asking them to memorize too much. They may not be able to do so. So help them to create props that they have available that they can use to tell the story about their inquiry experience. Sometimes it's a matter of having them share their product and tell the story about the process they went through to create the product and to describe it. So that brings us to the end of the webinar, and Sharon and I need a few moments. Feel free to continue the dialogue in the chat feature. We need just a quick moment to review some of the questions that have been posed, and then we'll respond to some of them. And Sharon was my note taker, and at this point I don't believe that we have received any questions. Are there any questions you'd like to pose for us before we sign off? Have you worked on assessing the quality of products as it aligns to the Common Core? Any tips that you have would be great. A lot of the districts that are approaching us to deliver PBL training are doing so because they feel like PBL is a vehicle to address the Common Core standards for so many reasons. But because the Common Core necessitates inquiry, and this is an inquiry-based curriculum design model. And so in terms of assessing the Common Core standards, absolutely. Those Common Core standards provide anchors or serve as anchor standards for the projects, and they should be articulated on the project planning forms, including the teaching and learning guide, and then can become the basis for the development of rubrics that are used to assess the products that the students can create. So we definitely emphasize that in our workshops. Let's see, how do you engage in reflection time in kindergarten? Do you have anything that you want to share about that, Sharon?
We just do so much oral, oral talk, and also sometimes me recording and using visuals. We do a lot of that in kindergarten. Also, I like the idea what you said in your project that Abby had used journals, because a lot of times my students would have in kindergarten reflection journals where they might just put pictures.
Fantastic, thanks. Could reflection be the end product? We have a lot of different types of reflection that we ask students to do, or that you as a PBL teacher can do with your students. You can have students reflect upon the quality of their culminating product. You can have them self-assess the product in relation to criteria, absolutely. They can reflect upon their collaboration skills used in the project. It really depends upon what your focus is.
I'll go ahead and take the one. You want to look at that one, Sarah? Somebody had mentioned in guided reading groups and reading workshops. Should all or most or some of the leveled readers be connected to the project? I suppose they could be. In my particular situation, I wasn't concerned too much about having those guided reading leveled readers connected to that topic, but I suppose they could be.
Awesome, thanks so much. We have time for one last question. Music, art, gym, etc. How do you connect all of these in a project? Many of our projects are interdisciplinary projects. Abby's Creatures in Oldham County project was an interdisciplinary project that integrated language arts and science. In telling the story about our project, I neglected to describe that it in fact integrated art as well, because it was an illustrated picture book about the life cycle of creatures in Oldham County. And so each team focused on a particular creature and developed the sections of the book that they co-constructed. And so the art teacher was responsible for guiding the students through the process of developing the illustrations. And so it's really, really helpful to determine, I think, the degree of integration that you want to have in a project, and so that all of the planning members can have clarity around their role that they will play. And I think it's helpful if that happens early on in the planning process, if all those folks who will play a role in the project can be at the table and discuss what they want to assess in their particular area, and how they're going to tackle the driving question in their subject area, and also their role with regard to the development of the project. One thing that we would encourage is if you're new to PBL, we see some teachers who are new to PBL planning from the start highly integrated projects that involve multiple people. Mm-hmm. We would consider that to be a project that's fairly large in scope. And so these interdisciplinary projects are phenomenal and exciting, but think about it. Is it something that you want to take on if you're new to PBL? It may be something you may want to start out smaller in scope before bringing in multiple subject areas in an integrated project. So that brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you so much for participating. We've appreciated the dialogue. And if you want further information about PBL, we encourage you to visit our website, bie.org. If you'd like to contact me personally, I'll share my email address. It is Sara, without an H, SARA @bie.org. Sharon, can you post that?
Sure can.
at BIE.org. All right, so that is the end of our webinar. Thank you so much for participating, and thank you, Sharon. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.